The vinyl of the bus station bench was split, weeping yellow foam through its seams like an old wound. It was 3 in the morning in a forgotten corner of Ohio, and the air inside the Greyhound terminal tasted of diesel exhaust, stale cigarette smoke, and the distinct metallic tang of human desperation. Outside, a merciless November rain slicked the asphalt, turning the neon signs of the neighboring diners into bleeding smears of red and blue. At 22, her entire universe had shrunk to the physical boundaries of that bench. She sat with her spine rigid, a human shield against the draft that whistled beneath the double-glass doors. Clutched in her lap was a single canvas duffel bag, its zipper broken and held together by a rusty safety pin. Inside were 2 changes of clothes for herself, a pack of generic diapers, and a faded fleece blanket. But her heaviest burden, and her only anchor, was the sleeping toddler curled against her collarbone. His small, hot breath puffed against her neck, a rhythmic reminder that she did not have the luxury of giving up. He was 2 years old, completely unaware that his mother's net worth amounted to exactly 3 crumpled dollar bills resting at the bottom of her coat pocket. She didn't look at the clock on the wall, because time had stopped meaning anything except the countdown until the security guard would inevitably tell her to move along. When the neon lights outside began to pale into the gray, washed-out hues of a Tuesday dawn, the guard did exactly that. A heavy hand tapped her shoulder, a gruff voice telling her that tickets were for passengers only, and she had been sitting there for 6 hours. She did not argue. She simply shifted the weight of her son onto her hip, slung the broken duffel over her shoulder, and walked out into the freezing rain. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She walked blindly, her sneakers instantly soaking through as she splashed through puddles. Her only objective was to find a ceiling, any ceiling, that didn't require a ticket to stand under. 2 blocks down, a set of heavy brass doors swung open as a group of men in heavy coats hurried inside. Above them, a stone eagle stared down from the facade of the county municipal building. Warmth, thick and heavy, with the smell of old paper and steam radiators, washed out into the street. She followed the heat inside, slipping through the doors unnoticed, blending into the morning crowd. She found herself in a high-ceilinged auditorium on the 2nd floor. It was humid, packed with men holding clipboards and whispering in low, transactional murmurs. She retreated to the very back row of wooden benches, gently lowering her waking son onto her lap. He whined softly, rubbing his eyes, and she shushed him with a gentle kiss on his forehead, pressing a cracker into his small hand. Up on the stage, a man with a microphone began to drone in a rhythmic, rapid-fire cadence. It was the county tax foreclosure auction. She watched, detached from reality, as properties were rattled off. Names of streets she had never heard of, plots of land and abandoned storefronts were bought and sold in seconds for thousands of dollars. It was a game played by people with safety nets, a world entirely foreign to a girl whose only goal for the day was finding a dry place to sit. Then the auctioneer paused, clearing his throat, his tone shifting from enthusiastic to dismissive. He shuffled his papers, reading out a description that sounded more like an obituary than a real estate listing. It was a condemned parcel of land by the river, a sliver of mud and timber tucked away at the edge of the county line. The auctioneer called it what it was, a structural liability, an environmental hazard threatened by the rising waters of the annual floods. The previous owner had abandoned it a decade ago, leaving a mountain of back taxes. The county just wanted it off their books, a clean slate. The opening bid was announced. No one moved. The men with the clipboards didn't even look up from their phones. The silence in the room grew heavy, a collective agreement that this specific piece of earth was worthless. Going once, the auctioneer chanted, his voice echoing off the linoleum floor. A sudden sharp panic seized her. The realization that the warmth of this building would end at 5 o'clock, that the rain outside was turning into sleet, and that she had nowhere to take her son when the sun went down. It was a madness born of absolute exhaustion, a desperate, wild impulse that bypassed all logic. She stood up. Her knees shook inside her damp jeans. "Going twice, $2, she said. Her voice was small, but in the quiet auditorium, it sounded like a gunshot. A few men in the front rows turned around, squinting through the dim light at the back of the room. They saw a 22-year-old girl in a soaked jacket, holding a toddler, her knuckles white around her canvas bag. A ripple of low laughter brushed through the crowd, a cruel, mocking sound. The auctioneer blinked, looking at her over the rim of his glasses. He looked at the paperwork, then at the clock, and finally back at her. He didn't want to carry the liability into the next quarter. The wooden gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. Sold, to the young lady in the back. The room immediately moved on to the next item, the brief distraction forgotten. She walked down the center aisle, her legs feeling like lead, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was sure her son could feel it. She reached the clerk's desk, extended her trembling hand, and placed 2 of her $3 bills onto the polished wood. The clerk didn't smile. He stamped the deed transfer with a heavy blue ink, slid the paper across the counter, and handed her a rusted, oversized iron key that felt as heavy as an anchor. She walked out of the building 10 minutes later. The rain was still falling, turning the streets into a blurred mirror of the gray sky. She held the legal document against her chest, beneath her coat, protecting it from the water. She was 22. She was a mother. She was a homeowner, and as she looked down at the rusted key in her palm, realizing she had absolutely no idea how to find the river or what kind of ruin she had just bought, a cold, suffocating terror washed over her, far sharper than the winter wind. The trek took nearly 4 hours on foot, a brutal march through the decaying fringes of the town where the sidewalks dissolved into gravel and the gravel eventually dissolved into mud. She walked along the highway shoulder, the broken duffel bag cutting a deep red welt into her shoulder, while her son whimpered, his small body shivering under the thin fleece blanket. The directions the county clerk had scribbled on the back of a receipt led them deeper into the lowlands, down a forgotten access road where the trees grew thick and tangled, their bare winter branches clawing at the gray sky like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavier, thick with the sharp, pungent scent of rotting vegetation and the low, ominous roar of moving water. She pushed through a dense thicket of choking, overgrown briars that tore at her jeans, holding her son high against her chest to shield his face from the thorns. Then, the trees cleared, and she stopped dead in her tracks. It was less of a house and more of a ghost made of rotting timber. The structure leaned precariously to the left, as if it were whispering a secret to the churning, mud-brown river that raced violently just 20 feet from its foundation. The exterior wood had turned the color of ash, stripped of its paint by decades of harsh Midwestern storms, and several windows were nothing but jagged teeth of broken glass. The front porch sagged toward the earth, its steps rotted through and swallowed by wild river weeds. It looked entirely uninhabitable, a monument to abandonment that seemed to be actively surrendering to the water below. A cold dread pooled in her stomach as she looked from the tilting roofline to the violent current of the river. This was what $2 bought, a beautiful ruin, an environmental hazard that felt ready to collapse into the silt at any moment. She carefully picked her way across the soft, spongy ground, avoiding the collapsed porch steps, and lifted her son onto the threshold. The rusted iron key she had been clutching felt freezing against her palm. She jammed it into the heavy oak door, expecting the mechanism to be seized by time, but with a stiff, agonizing groan, the lock turned. She pushed. The door resisted, swollen with moisture, before finally giving way with a loud scrape against the warped floorboards. Stepping inside was like stepping into a tomb. The air was thick, heavy with the oppressive smell of river silt, damp wool, and the unmistakable aroma of decades of stagnant, undisturbed time. It was freezing indoors, perhaps even colder than the air outside, because the walls trapped the dampness like a sponge. Above them, the rain beat a relentless tattoo against the roof, and a rhythmic, echoing plip-plop reverberated through the darkness as water dripped steadily through the ceiling, pooling in the center of the main room. She stood in the dim twilight of the entryway, her eyes adjusting to the shadows. The floor tilted slightly beneath her feet, mirroring the house's external lean. Peeling strips of ancient floral wallpaper hung from the walls like shedding skin, exposing the dark, damp lath underneath. There was no electricity, no heat, no running water. There was only the vast, echoing emptiness of a shell that had forgotten what it felt like to hold life. Her son began to cry in earnest then, the sound sharp and terrified in the hollow space. The noise snapped her out of her paralysis. The sun was dipping below the tree line, and the gray light was rapidly dying into a pitch-black winter night. She didn't have time to despair. She only had time to survive. She carried her son into the small alcove adjacent to the main room, which seemed structurally sounder and free from the direct paths of the ceiling leaks. Setting the canvas duffel bag down, she knelt on the dusty floorboards. She pulled her sweater off, laying it down as a base layer against the cold wood. With frantic, desperate movements, she unpacked their meager belongings, creating a fortress of old blankets in the farthest corner of the room, away from the drafts that whistled through the broken window panes. She curled her body around her son, pulling the faded fleece over both of them, using her own body heat to keep the chill from his bones. She fed him the last of the crackers in the dark, watching him chew slowly until his eyelids grew heavy, and he finally drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep. The darkness that settled over the riverside was absolute, broken only by the occasional flash of distant lightning that illuminated the skeletal room. In those brief, stark flashes, she watched the long shadows stretch across the peeling wallpaper, twisting into monstrous shapes that seemed to mock her. The roar of the river outside was a constant, deafening presence, a reminder of the thin line between her new home and the destructive power of nature. She lay awake for hours, her muscles cramping from the cold, her mind racing in a vicious circle. She looked at the damp ceiling, listened to the relentless drip of the water, and felt the terrifying tilt of the floor beneath her back. She had wanted a roof over their heads, a shield against the world that had rejected them at every turn. But as the wind howled through the rotting timber and the house groaned under the strain of the storm, she couldn't shake the suffocating fear that she hadn't found a sanctuary at all. She wondered, with a devastating certainty, if she had simply traded one trap for another, buying a front-row seat to their own undoing. Morning did not arrive with a gentle sunrise. It bled through the broken windows in bruised shades of purple and slate gray. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a heavy, dripping silence broken only by the continuous, rushing roar of the river. She woke with a violent shiver, her muscles locked and aching from the hard floor and the bone-deep dampness. Beside her, her son was still asleep, a small, fragile knot of warmth under the fleece. She stood up slowly, her joints popping in the cold, and assessed her kingdom of ruin in the daylight. It was worse than the shadows had suggested. The floorboards were slick with a fine layer of river mud, tracked in by years of high water. Animal nests choked the corners of the ceiling, and the air was thick with a fine, chalky dust. She had no money for contractors, no credit for hardware store supplies, and absolutely no margin for error. If this skeletal structure was going to be a home, she would have to rip the decay out of it with her own two hands. She found an abandoned, rusted bucket in the overgrown backyard and a scrap of coarse burlap that had once been a feed sack. Carrying water up from the river's edge, a treacherous, muddy slope that tested her balance with every step, she began to clean. It was agonizing, primitive labor. She scrubbed the floorboards on her hands and knees until her knuckles were raw and bleeding, her skin turning an angry, chapped red from the freezing water. While she worked, her son sat safely on a clean patch of wood she had aggressively scoured. He was remarkably quiet, occupied with a pile of smooth, flat river stones she had gathered for him. He stacked them meticulously, building his own miniature towers, seemingly unfazed by the devastation around them. His resilience was the quiet fuel that kept her moving when the cold threatened to seep into her heart. For 3 days, the routine was the same. She scrounged for firewood, boiling river water in a salvage tin pot to wash with, and survived on the few non-perishables she had bought with the last of her loose change. She tore down the molding, waterlogged wallpaper in strips, peeling it back to reveal the sturdy, if stained, plaster underneath. Slowly, agonizingly, the house began to shed its skin of neglect. It didn't look like a home yet, but it was beginning to smell less like a tomb. By the 4th afternoon, she turned her attention to the root cellar. It was a terrifying space, accessible only by a trapdoor in the kitchen floor that groaned in protest when lifted. The air down there was different. It didn't just smell damp. It breathed the cold, mineral essence of the river itself. The earth walls were lined with decaying brick, and a massive, crumbling stone hearth stood in the center, a relic from a time when the house relied on a central fire to survive the brutal winters. The drywall surrounding the hearth was completely compromised, swollen and black with toxic rot. It had to come out before the mold spread upward into the joists. She found a heavy, rusted crowbar half buried in the mud near the back porch and hauled it down into the cellar. The work was suffocating. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light filtering down through the trapdoor as she swung the heavy iron bar. She brought it down against the rotten drywall, the damp plaster crumbling easily, releasing a cloud of acrid, ancient dust that coated the back of her throat. She swung again and again, tearing chunks of the wall away, exposing the dark, empty space between the framing and the original brick foundation. She wiped the sweat and dirt from her forehead with the back of her wrist, her chest heaving, and raised the crowbar for another strike. Clang. The sound was sharp, hollow, and entirely unexpected. It wasn't the dull thud of rotting wood or the scrape of brick. It was the distinct, resonant echo of heavy metal striking metal. She froze, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. She lowered the crowbar and stepped closer to the gaping hole she had created next to the hearth. The shadows were thick, refusing to yield their secrets. She dropped to her knees, ignoring the sharp bite of gravel through her jeans, and reached her hands into the darkness of the wall cavity. Her fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and unmistakably foreign to the structure of a house. Working frantically now, she tore at the remaining drywall with her bare hands, snapping the brittle lath boards and tossing them aside. The hole widened, and as the ambient light from the trapdoor fell into the recess, she saw it. Wedged deep within a meticulously carved hollow in the foundation, directly behind the protective mass of the hearth, sat a massive iron lockbox. It was a brutal, heavy thing, secured with thick brass hinges that glinted faintly under a layer of grime. What struck her immediately was not just its size, but its condition. While the house around it had surrendered to a century of moisture and decay, the box was pristine. It was tightly wrapped in a thick, dark oilskin, tied securely with tarred rope that had completely repelled the dampness of the river. She grabbed the heavy rope handles and pulled. It barely moved. It was incredibly heavy, anchored by its own dense weight. Gritting her teeth, she planted her boots against the brickwork for leverage and hauled backward with everything she had. With a slow, grinding scrape, the lockbox slid free of its century-old tomb, dragging out into the dim light of the cellar floor. She knelt before it, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The air in the cellar felt suddenly charged, the heavy silence broken only by the thudding of her own heart. She stared at the oilskin, her bleeding hands hovering over the rough knots of the rope. In a house that was falling apart, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that this specific object remained perfectly, eternally preserved. She did not open the box in the cellar. The darkness down there felt too heavy, too sacred, as if she were intruding upon a grave. Instead, she hauled the massive iron chest up through the trapdoor, centimeter by agonizing centimeter, until it slid onto the scrubbed floorboards of the kitchen. Her son stopped playing with his river stones, his wide eyes watching as she collapsed beside the object, her lungs burning, her muscles shaking from the exertion. The tarred rope was stiff, hardened by time, but she picked at the knots with a broken fingernail until they finally unraveled. She pulled away the thick oilskin. It came off in a single heavy sheet, releasing a sudden, surprising scent, not of rot, but of dried lavender, beeswax, and cedar. The lockbox itself was a masterpiece of black iron, its heavy latch secured by a complex, tarnished brass mechanism. She didn't have a key that fit this lock, but the metal was old and the hinges were stressed. She took her rusted crowbar, wedged the flat edge beneath the lip of the lid, and leaned her entire body weight against the iron bar. The metal groaned, a high-pitched scream of resisting steel, and then, with a violent, resounding snap, the lock surrendered. She held her breath, braced for the glint of silver or gold coins, the kind of easy wealth that would solve every immediate problem in her desperate life. But as the heavy lid swung open on its hinges, her breath caught in her throat for an entirely different reason. There was no gold. There was something far more intimate, far more deliberate. Nestled perfectly inside the cedar-lined interior were heavy rolls of thick vellum paper, tied with faded silk ribbons. Beneath them lay dozens of small leather-bound journals, their covers stained a deep, rich mahogany. She reached out, her dirty fingers hesitant to touch the immaculate white edges of the documents. She gently pulled the first roll of vellum from its resting place, untying the ribbon with careful precision. As she unrolled the thick paper across the floor, weighting the edges down with her son's smooth river stones, a breathtaking world unfurled before her eyes. It was an architectural blueprint, but unlike any she had ever imagined. The lines were drawn with an incredibly fine, obsessive hand, rendered in a brilliant indigo ink that hadn't faded a fraction. It was a massive, sprawling master plan for the very land she was standing on. But it didn't show roads or factories. It showed a magnificent, sprawling eco-sanctuary. There were intricate drawings of water filtration labyrinths engineered directly into the riverbanks, massive glass conservatories that looked like crystal palaces, and winding pathways lined with names of rare, exotic flora. She picked up the top journal, opening the cover with a reverence she hadn't known she possessed. The inside page bore a name written in an elegant, sweeping cursive: Julian Vance, landscape architect, 1888. But as she began to read the tightly packed, elegant script, the true nature of the vault revealed itself. The handwriting changed on the very next page, softening into a personal, candid diary. Julian Vance was a ghost, a phantom, a necessary lie. The journals belonged to a woman. She had been a visionary landscape architect in an era that refused to allow women into the rooms of power, let alone permit them to design the public parks of a rapidly industrializing nation. To see her grand designs brought to life, she had been forced to hide her genius behind a male pseudonym, conducting her business through correspondence and a trusted male associate. This dilapidated house by the river hadn't been built as a simple dwelling. It was the living laboratory, the foundational nerve center for a massive, forgotten public arboretum and wetland sanctuary. The woman had bought hundreds of acres along the river, engineering the soil, planting dormant, rare hybrid seeds, and designing a natural fortress that could harness and purify the seasonal floodwaters rather than be destroyed by them. It was a masterpiece of ecological engineering, designed a century before the world even understood the term. But as she flipped through the subsequent journals, the ink grew hurried, the tone darkening with a desperate, heartbreaking despair. The legacy had been systematically destroyed. A powerful consortium of local industrialists and corrupt politicians, eager to turn the riverfront into coal yards and textile mills, had discovered her true identity. They used her gender to invalidate her land titles, tied her up in predatory lawsuits, and launched a smear campaign that effectively erased her name from the city's historical records. They choked her sanctuary out with eminent domain, leaving her with nothing but this single small plot of land where her house stood, a final, defiant holdout. The last entry was written in the winter of 1894, the ink smeared as if by tears. "They have paved over the eastern meadows," the passage read. "They think they have buried the dream. But nature does not forget. I have hid the blueprints of the sanctuary in the very bones of the earth. Let the water guard them until someone arrives who knows how to listen to the river." She sat in the freezing kitchen, the leather journal heavy in her lap, tears blurring her vision. She looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the tilting floor, the rotting timber. This wasn't just a worthless piece of junk real estate that the county wanted to discard. It was a sacred, stolen heritage. She looked down at her own raw, bleeding hands, then at her son, who was currently tracing the blue lines of the blueprint with his tiny finger. For months, she had felt like a ghost herself, invisible to the world, pushed to the margins of society, judged for being young, poor, and alone. She recognized the pain in those handwritten pages because it was the very same pain she carried in her chest. A profound, electrifying shift occurred within her in that quiet moment, the suffocating terror that had haunted her since the auction vanished, replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. She had bought a ruin for $2, but she had inherited a legacy. She wasn't just a homeless girl hiding in a broken house anymore. She was the custodian of a forgotten woman's genius, and she was going to make sure the river finally gave up its secrets. The single kerosene lantern she had bartered for, at a local farm stand, became her son. Every night, after her son had drifted into a peaceful sleep beneath his fortress of blankets, she sat cross-legged on the floor, the golden flame casting long, dancing shadows across the exposed plaster walls. She devoured the journals page by page, word by word, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She did not just read the text, she studied the intricate cross-sections of the earth, memorizing the specific chemical compositions of the soil and the complex fluid dynamics of the riverbanks that the architect had mapped out over a century ago. She learned that the property was not a structural liability at all, but a beautifully engineered machine. The house had been anchored into a deep limestone shelf, designed to flex slightly with the shifting weight of the earth. More importantly, she discovered the secret of the suffocating muddy bank outside. The architect had not merely planted a garden, she had constructed a highly sophisticated, multi-tiered natural filtration system. Beneath the thick, choked layers of mud and dead vegetation lay a hidden grid of porous volcanic stone and charcoal trenches designed to purify the runoff from the upstream factories, creating a localized microclimate where delicate, rare ecosystems could thrive. According to the journals, the soil along their stretch of the riverbank had been heavily enriched with a proprietary organic compost designed to preserve dormant seeds for generations, keeping them in a state of suspended animation until the right environmental conditions were met. The architect had hidden her crowning achievements right there in the mud, rare, genetically engineered heirloom hybrids that the world believed had been lost to industrialization forever. When spring finally arrived, breaking the icy grip of winter, she stopped reading and began to execute. Armed with nothing but her bare hands, the rusted crowbar, and the boundless, fierce energy of a mother who had found a purpose, she went to war against the decay outside. While her son sat in a patch of fresh grass, laughing as he watched birds nest in the willow trees, she began the brutal work of clearing the land. She spent weeks hacking away at the thick, choking mats of invasive briars and purple loosestrife that had suffocated the riverbank for 50 years. She dragged the heavy, thorny brush away in giant piles, exposing the rich, dark soil beneath. She followed the architect's handwritten maps meticulously, digging down with her fingers to clear the debris from the hidden stone filtration channels, allowing the stagnant, muddy pools to drain back into the main river current. As the spring sun began to bake the newly cleared earth, the transformation began to manifest, slowly at first, and then with a breathtaking, explosive violence. It started with tiny, translucent green shoots pushing through the dark silt. Within weeks, the muddy, uninviting bank was completely overtaken by an impossible canvas of color. Long dormant hybrid river lilies, with petals the color of crushed plums and soft cream, opened their faces to the morning mist. Beside them, clustered along the newly cleared limestone ledges, priceless heirloom orchids, variants that had vanished from botanical textbooks before the turn of the century, bloomed in spectacular, cascading ribbons of fire orange and deep indigo. The air around the house changed, losing its sharp scent of rot and replacing it with a rich, intoxicating perfume of damp earth and honeyed blossoms. The house was no longer a ghost. It was a living, breathing sanctuary, surrounded by a botanical miracle that was drawing its strength from the very river that had once threatened to destroy it. But she knew that beauty alone would not keep the roof over her son's head. She was a realist, acutely aware that the world outside their hidden oasis was governed by laws, deeds, and money. The sheer historical and environmental significance of what she had uncovered in the root cellar was too massive to keep hidden in a crumbling kitchen. The legacy did not belong to her alone. It belonged to history, and it was her responsibility to weaponize it for their protection. One morning, she carefully wrapped 3 of the most detailed vellum blueprints and 2 of the earliest leather journals back into the protective oilskin. She dressed her son in his cleanest clothes, slung her broken duffel bag over her shoulder, and walked back into the city. She did not go to a real estate agent or a lawyer. She walked straight onto the sprawling brick campus of the state university, navigating the labyrinth of academic buildings until she found the Department of Architectural Preservation and Environmental History. She walked into the main office, her boots still stained with the rich river mud, her face weathered by weeks of hard labor under the sun. The receptionist looked up, eyes lingering on her faded jacket and the toddler clinging to her hip, clearly assuming she was looking for a handout or had wandered into the wrong building. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but guarded. She didn't hesitate. She stepped up to the counter, unstrapped the safety pin holding her duffel bag together, and pulled out the oilskin package. She carefully unfolded the heavy material, revealing the brilliant, indigo ink blueprint of the 1888 eco-sanctuary, laying it flat across the glossy mahogany desk. "I bought a property at the county tax auction for $2, she said, her voice steady, clear, and ringing with an undeniable authority. "This was buried in the foundation. I need to speak with someone who understands what they are looking at." A young professor, passing through the lobby with a stack of grading papers, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto the intricate cursive signature of Julian Vance at the bottom of the vellum sheet, and then traveled to the breathtakingly advanced hydraulic designs of the water filtration grid. The papers slipped from his hand, scattering across the floor, but he didn't even notice. He stepped toward the counter, his face pale, his breath catching as he looked from the blueprint to the girl who had brought it out of the dark. The university's excitement had barely begun to ripple through the academic community when the real world came knocking on her door, sounding like a heavy leather boot striking her swollen front entryway. It was an exceptionally hot morning in late May, the air thick with the sweet, heavy perfume of the blooming river lilies, when a sleek black sedan crawled down the gravel access road, kicking up clouds of dust that coated the vibrant wildflowers. A man stepped out of the vehicle, his tailored charcoal suit and polished leather shoes jarringly out of place against the raw, wild beauty of the riverbank. He was a prominent local developer, a man whose name was plastered across billboards and luxury apartment complexes all over the county. For years, his company had been quietly buying up the surrounding parcels, waiting for the perfect moment to clear-cut the trees and erect a multi-million-dollar wall of high-end luxury condominiums overlooking the water. This forgotten, dilapidated sliver of land was the final piece of his puzzle, a stubborn gap in his master plan. He did not offer a handshake. He simply stood on the sagging perimeter of her porch, looking down his nose at her with a condescending smile that made her blood run cold. He offered her $10,000 in cash, a pittance to him, but a sum he clearly assumed would look like a fortune to a 22-year-old girl living in a house without electricity. When she didn't instantly reach for the contract, his smile vanished, replaced by the cold, bureaucratic arrogance of a man who was used to buying whatever he wanted. He laid it out for her in plain, clinical terms. If she didn't take the money, his legal team would destroy her. They had already filed a petition with the county zoning board, citing her property as a structural liability and an environmental hazard. They were leveraging a century-old loophole regarding seasonal floodplains, arguing that her presence on the land was a public safety risk. The county would condemn the building, issue an eviction notice, and seize the land through eminent domain within 30 days. She would be back on the street, back on the Greyhound station bench, with absolutely nothing to her name. He left the contract on the rusted hood of an old barrel, gave her a final, warning look, and drove away, leaving the stench of exhaust to linger over the orchids. A year ago, or even 3 months ago, that threat would have crushed her. The sheer terror of losing the only roof over her son's head would have driven her to sign the papers, take the cash, and run. But she was no longer the broken girl from the bus terminal. She looked at her son, who was currently chasing a yellow butterfly through a patch of brilliant orange orchids, and then she looked toward the root cellar, where the iron box had rested for 100 years. She was no longer just fighting for a place to sleep. She was the shield standing between a ravenous machine and the sacred, stolen genius of a woman who had been erased by the very same greed a century prior. History was trying to repeat itself, trying to pave over the miracle a second time. She refused to let the river be silenced. She didn't pack her bags. Instead, she spent the next 72 hours working by the light of her kerosene lantern, cross-referencing the developer's legal petition against the meticulous records in the architect's journals. She found exactly what she needed on the final pages of the 1891 ledger. The architect, anticipating that the industrial barons of her era would try to use zoning laws to seize her sanctuary, had legally registered the entire parcel not as residential property, but as an engineered, self-sustaining historical watershed. She had established a permanent, irrevocable environmental easement, tied directly to the subterranean limestone foundation and the volcanic stone filtration grid. Under state law, an engineered watershed designed to protect the municipal water supply from industrial contamination could never be zoned for commercial or high-density residential development. The loophole the developer was trying to use had actually been sealed shut by a genius mind over 100 years ago. On the morning of the emergency county zoning hearing, she walked into the municipal building, the very same humid auditorium where she had bought the house for $2. The developer sat at the front table, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers in identical suits, looking confident and entirely at ease. The 3 county commissioners sat on the elevated dais, looking bored, ready to rubber stamp the eviction notice and move on to lunch. When her name was called, she stood up from the back row. She didn't have a legal team, but she had a heavy leather bag slung over her shoulder. She walked down the center aisle, her posture straight, her gaze fixed entirely on the commissioners. The developer's lead attorney stood up, offering a smooth, rehearsed speech about structural decay, public safety, and the necessity of clearing away unfortunate eyesores to make room for economic progress. He presented photographs of the house from the winter, emphasizing its precarious lean over the water. When it was her turn to speak, she did not beg for mercy, nor did she talk about her poverty. She opened her bag and drew out the master blueprints, unrolling them across the presentation board with a sharp, dramatic snap. Beside them, she placed the official university authentication documents signed by the head of the preservation department, proving the historical significance of the site. She pointed directly to the intricate schematics of the filtration grid. She explained, her voice echoing with an absolute, undeniable clarity, how the land was currently functioning exactly as it had been engineered to do. She showed the board the data she had gathered with the university's help, proving that her restoration of the plant life had dropped the chemical toxicity of the local river runoff by nearly 40% in just 2 months. "This is not a hazard," she said, her eyes locked onto the lead commissioner. "This is a federally protected, historically registered watershed. The previous owner did not abandon this land. She fortified it against the very exploitation you are trying to approve today. According to the original state deed restriction of 1891, which remains entirely valid, this land cannot be bought, sold, or altered for commercial gain. You cannot evict me because I am not a squatter. I am the legal steward of a protected historical landmark." The room fell into a stunned, dead silence. The developer's lawyers scrambled, shuffling through their papers, whispering frantically to one another as they realized the trap they had walked into. The lead commissioner put on his glasses, leaning forward to inspect the indigo ink of the ancient blueprint, his expression shifting from boredom to profound awe. The developer stood up, his face turning an angry, mottled red, but the commissioner raised a hand to silence him. The law was written in black ink and weathered vellum, anchored by a century of mathematical brilliance that no amount of corporate money could erase. The tide had turned, and the rising water was about to swallow their ambitions whole. The heavy wooden gavel fell for the second time in that room, but this time, the sound was not a desperate gamble. It was a declaration of absolute victory. The county commissioners denied the developer's petition on the spot, citing the ironclad environmental protections woven into the original 1891 deed. Within 48 hours, the frantic whispers of the courtroom erupted into a public awakening. The university's preservation department held a major press conference, displaying the indigo ink blueprints and the leather-bound journals under protective glass. The revelation of a forgotten female pioneer who had secretly engineered the city's defense against industrial pollution captured the public imagination. Local historical societies, environmental advocacy groups, and ordinary citizens rallied behind her with a fierce, protective urgency. They flooded the city council with demands, turning the crumbling riverside property into a symbol of historical justice and ecological survival. Before the summer heat could fade into autumn, the state officially stepped in. The house, along with every single acre of the surrounding wetlands, was granted permanent historical landmark status. The developer's luxury condo project was permanently dismantled, his permits revoked, and his sleek black sedans vanished from the gravel access road for good. The machinery of corporate greed had been utterly halted by the brilliant, enduring math of a woman who had died a century ago, brought back to life by a mother who refused to be broken. But the triumph did not stop at mere preservation. Wealthy philanthropists and a prominent regional conservation trust, deeply moved by the story, stepped forward to turn the blueprint into a reality. They established a massive endowment specifically dedicated to the full restoration of the Julian Vance Eco-Sanctuary. When the executives of the trust sat down with her in their glass-walled offices, offering a substantial lump sum buyout to turn the property into a public park, she did not hesitate to decline. She didn't want to sell her home. She wanted to fulfill the dream. Recognizing her unparalleled devotion and her intimate, first-hand knowledge of the land, the trust proposed an alternative partnership. They created a permanent lifetime stewardship position tailored specifically for her. The position came with a generous annual living stipend, full health benefits for her and her son, and a substantial budget for professional restoration crews, heavy machinery, and botanical supplies. She was no longer a squatter dodging the law, nor was she a desperate girl trading her dignity for a roof. She was the official director of the legacy she had pulled from the mud. The iron key she had bought for $2 had finally unlocked a life of security, dignity, and profound purpose. Time did not pass in a series of jagged, painful struggles anymore. It flowed over the property like a gentle, healing current, blurring the years into a seamless montage of growth and transformation. The house was no longer a ghost of rotting timber leaning precariously over the mud. With the backing of the Conservation Trust and the skilled hands of historical architects, the structure was lovingly reborn. They replaced the crumbling joists, reinforced the foundation with deep limestone pillars, and replaced the broken glass with massive, custom-built windows that flooded the interior with golden, uninhibited sunlight. The peeling floral wallpaper was gone, replaced by smooth, cream-colored walls that proudly displayed framed pages of the original botanical sketches she had salvaged from the dark. The suffocating scent of rot and stagnant neglect had vanished completely, replaced by the crisp, sweet aroma of cedarwood, beeswax, and the continuous, vibrant fragrance of the blooming river lilies outside. The house had stopped groaning under the strain of the winter winds. It stood proud, grounded, and resilient, a beautifully restored, sun-drenched haven where the roaring river no longer threatened their survival, but instead sang a constant, soothing lullaby that echoed through the bright hallway. The surrounding wetlands grew into the magnificent public arboretum the original architect had envisioned over a century ago, winding gravel pathways, lined with educational plaques detailing the hidden water filtration labyrinths cut through the sprawling meadows. The rare hybrid orchids and plum-colored lilies had multiplied by the thousands, creating a breathtaking rolling sea of fire orange, deep indigo, and cream that drew visitors from all over the country. The land was alive, breathing, and completely healed, its subterranean volcanic stones tirelessly purifying the water, keeping the sanctuary safe from the rising tides of the changing world. On a warm, late summer afternoon, she stood on the wide, reinforced wooden deck that extended gracefully over the riverbank. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of purple and brilliant gold, mirroring the very colors of the flowers below. Her hair was touched with a few subtle streaks of gray, and her hands, though still holding the faint calluses of a woman who loved the earth, were no longer raw or bleeding. She wore a soft, comfortable linen shirt, her posture relaxed and imbued with a quiet, unshakable authority. She looked out across the vibrant, blooming riverside gardens, her gaze landing on a tall, confident teenager sprinting down the gravel path. Her son was no longer the restless, shivering toddler who had clung to her neck in the freezing dark of the Greyhound station. He was 16 now, his eyes bright with intelligence, his laughter ringing out clear and unburdened over the sound of the rushing water as he chased a stray dog through the tall grass. He had grown up with clean air, a secure roof, and a profound understanding of what it meant to guard something sacred. He knew his mother was a hero, not because she had conquered a wilderness, but because she had listened to a ghost when the rest of the world was entirely deaf. She leaned against the sturdy cedar railing of the deck, taking a deep, slow breath of the sweet evening air. A soft, reflective smile brushed across her lips. When she was 22, cold, terrified, and utterly abandoned by society, she had walked into a humid municipal building with $3 in her pocket, believing she was buying a worthless, dynamic ruin just to survive the night. She had thought she was saving a broken house. In truth, she had inherited a forgotten woman's legacy, a magnificent, enduring genius that reached through a century of silence to wrap its arms around her, pulling her out of the dark and rebuilding her life from the very inside out.